condemned to the violent shadows of the criminal underworld, yet hailed as a titan of the British Empire. He is Lord Boothby, his captor, Ronnie Kray. Why would a statesman willingly surrender to a ruthless mobster, igniting what many historians call Britain's most dangerous gay scandal? The polite, polished veneer of 1960s London hit a deeply fractured reality. The swinging 60s are often remembered for the Beatles and cultural liberation, but beneath that bright surface lay an intensely hypocritical society. The British establishment, the politicians, the aristocrats, the judges, operated within a rigid framework of absolute propriety. They dictated the moral direction of the country while strictly enforcing archaic laws. Homosexual acts between men were not just frowned upon. They were serious criminal offenses punishable by years in prison, hard labor, and total social annihilation. For a man of standing with forbidden desires, life was a suffocating paranoia. Every single day a loaded gun was pressed against his temple. Lord Bob Boothby navigated this minefield with reckless arrogance. This insatiable hunger for danger was not born overnight. He was raised in the freezing emotional vacuum of an elite household. Parental coldness was considered a virtue. Affection was a sign of weakness. Educated at Eton, he moved within circles that fiercely guarded hidden royal secrets. He was the quintessential English gentleman, perfectly trained to mask his internal voids. He was wealthy, charming, and highly visible. He was a pioneer of early television, a frequent panelist on popular shows, projecting an image of grandfatherly wisdom and robust common sense. He was a ladies' man, famously engaging in a long-standing affair with the wife of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. This was the public Boothby, untouchable, deeply embedded in the corridors of power, a man whose word could sway legislation and whose presence commanded immediate respect. But behind the heavy oak doors of his Belgravia apartment, a profound emptiness consumed him. Boothby was deeply, excruciatingly bored. The endless cycle of parliamentary debates, polite cocktail parties, and diplomatic dinners felt like a slow, creeping death. The aristocratic circles he moved in felt entirely artificial, populated by people who guarded their emotions and spoke in carefully measured diplomatic codes. Boothby craved authenticity. He craved the visceral, undeniable reality of raw human nature. More specifically, he harbored a deep, insatiable appetite for what was known in the underground lexicon as rough trade. Rough trade transcends mere romance or quiet companionship. It manifests as a psychologically complex fetish, a dark desire born entirely out of extreme class division. For a man of Boothby's extreme privilege, true arousal came from the complete inversion of his public life. He sought out working-class men, laborers, dock workers, and petty criminals. He wanted men whose hands were calloused, whose language was coarse, and whose capacity for sudden violence was always simmering just below the surface. The thrill did not merely lie in the sexual act itself, but in the staggering risk involved. Stepping into a dingy pub in the East End, stripping away his title and placing his physical safety in the hands of a man who despised his wealth. That was the ultimate aphrodisiac. It was the thrill of standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the person holding your hand might decide to push you at any given second. The intense, terrifying vulnerability was the only thing that made Boothby feel genuinely alive. While Boothby was actively seeking out the shadows, Ronnie Kray was already ruling them. The East End of London in the early 1960s was a different universe from the manicured lawns of Westminster. It was a gritty, bomb-scarred landscape dominated by protection rackets, illegal gambling, and brutal territorial wars. At the absolute apex of this food chain sat Ronnie and his twin brother Reggie. Together they ran the Firm, a criminal syndicate that operated with unprecedented efficiency and terrifying ruthlessness. They were not just thugs, they were underworld celebrities. They owned lucrative nightclubs that attracted Hollywood stars, bridging the seemingly impossible gap between violent crime and high society glamour. But while Reggie played the role of the sharp-suited, calculating businessman, Ronnie was an entirely different breed of monster. Ronnie Kray was a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic, and his condition went largely untreated. His violence was not strictly business. It was theatrical, explosive, and deeply sadistic. He viewed himself as a military commander, demanding to be called the Colonel by his terrified subordinates. He was prone to sudden, terrifying shifts in mood, ordering vicious beatings or executions simply because he believed someone had looked at him with disrespect. He was a man deeply disconnected from reality, operating on a frequency of pure, unadulterated menace. Crucially, in the hyper-masculine, intensely homophobic environment of the London underworld, Ronnie Kray was openly, unapologetically homosexual. This was a staggering anomaly. In a world where even a rumor of homosexuality could result in a razor attack, Ronnie flaunted his preferences. No one dared utter a word of mockery, because to do so meant certain death. Ronnie did not view his sexuality as a weakness to be hidden. He wielded it like a weapon. He understood the desperate, pathetic vulnerability of closeted men from the upper classes. He knew that their secrets were a currency far more valuable than cash. He observed the wealthy men who occasionally drifted into his clubs looking for rough thrills, and he recognized them not as patrons, but as prey. The Krays were already incredibly wealthy. Beyond mere financial extortion, Ronnie Kray craved an elusive prize. He wanted establishment legitimacy. He wanted to force the very society that looked down upon him to acknowledge his power. He wanted to own a piece of the elite. When he learned that one of the most famous politicians in the country had a dangerous appetite for the exact type of violent young men that the Firm controlled, Ronnie saw a political goldmine. He saw an opportunity to acquire a hostage who possessed the power to influence laws, manipulate the police, and shield the Kray empire from the consequences of their actions. The collision of these two vastly different worlds required a bridge, and that bridge was a young man named Leslie Holt. Holt was everything Boothby desired. He was a small-time criminal, a cat burglar who possessed a rugged, dangerous charm. He survived on his wits, navigating the fringes of the underworld. He became Boothby's chauffeur, his lover, and eventually his procurer. Holt understood Boothby's specific tastes and happily supplied him with a steady stream of young, tough men from the East End. But Holt was also a known associate of the Krays. It did not take long for Ronnie's vast intelligence network to pick up on the fact that Holt was spending a great deal of time in Belgravia, driving around a very famous, very wealthy lord. Ronnie summoned Holt. The dynamic was not a negotiation. It was a directive. Ronnie demanded an introduction to the powerful parliamentarian. Holt, caught between the lucrative patronage of a lord and the lethal demands of a psychopathic gangster, had no choice but to comply. He orchestrated a meeting, bringing the Titan of Westminster directly into the den of the East End kingpin. The initial encounters took place at Cedra Court, a seemingly nondescript block of flats in Hackney that served as the nerve center for Ronnie's operations. Stepping into Cedra Court was stepping into an alternate reality. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cigars, spilled liquor, and the sharp tang of adrenaline. These were not the refined social gatherings Boothby was accustomed to. These were debauched, dangerous orgies where high-stakes gangsters, corrupt police officers, and desperate young men mingled under Ronnie's watchful, unblinking eyes. For Boothby, walking into this environment was like injecting pure electricity into his veins. He was entirely captivated. Surrounded by hardened killers and the violent young men he so desperately craved, Boothby felt a supreme sense of power and liberation. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. He viewed himself as an aristocrat slumming it, observing the beasts in their natural habitat, confident that his title and his immense public standing acted as an impenetrable shield. He was catastrophically wrong. He was not the zookeeper. He was the main course. While Boothby lost himself in the intoxicating thrill of forbidden danger, many historians suggest Ronnie Kray was executing a flawless, cold-blooded honey trap. Ronnie was meticulous. He ensured that Boothby was always surrounded by witnesses, men loyal entirely to the firm. He encouraged Boothby to relax, to let his guard down completely, and most importantly, he collected evidence. A seemingly innocuous photograph snapped during a party. Alongside careless handwritten notes offering casual invitations to his Belgravia home. To an outsider, these items might seem trivial, but Ronnie knew that in the venomous, morally rigid political climate of the 1960s, these small artifacts were weapons of mass destruction. They were the undeniable proof of a secret life that would guarantee Boothby a prison sentence and eternal disgrace. The psychological trap was set with terrifying precision. Boothby was allowed to indulge his darkest, most dangerous desires. He was given unrestricted access to the rough trade he was addicted to. But the cost of this access was total, silent subjugation. Without a single threat being spoken aloud, the power dynamic entirely inverted. The statesman who debated the future of the nation on the floor of the House of Lords was now entirely at the mercy of a man who hallucinated enemies and settled disputes with a carving knife. The relationship transformed from a reckless pursuit of pleasure into a suffocating hostage situation. Boothby had walked directly into the cage, locked the door behind himself, and handed the key to a madman. This was the fragile, tragic contradiction of human desire. A man who possessed the intelligence to navigate the most complex political landscapes on earth was utterly blinded by his own primal needs. He sought to escape the suffocating safety of his life by seeking out the absolute extreme of danger, failing to realize that the danger he sought was not a temporary thrill, but a permanent, inescapable trap. The foundation of his entire life, built over decades of public service and careful maneuvering, now rested entirely on the volatile, unpredictable whims of Ronnie Kray. The true horror was not merely that Boothby was being blackmailed. It was that he had actively, eagerly, and willingly participated in the construction of his own political and personal guillotine. The trap had snapped shut, and the true cost of his addiction was about to be violently extracted. The photograph itself was entirely unremarkable in its composition, yet it possessed the destructive power of a political atom bomb. Taken in the opulent surrounding of Boothby's apartment at 1 Eaton Square in Belgravia, the image captured 3 men sitting casually on a floral-patterned sofa. On the far left sat Lord Boothby, looking every inch the relaxed, jovial aristocrat, a drink resting comfortably near his hand. In the center sat Ronnie Kray, his dark suit immaculate, his gaze characteristically intense, projecting a quiet, lethal authority that seemed entirely out of place among the fine art and expensive upholstery. And completing the trio was the bridge between their worlds, Leslie Holt, the handsome, rugged cat burglar who shared both their beds. To the untrained eye, it was merely a snapshot of friends sharing a quiet evening. But in the context of 1960s Britain, it was a death warrant. Ronnie Kray knew exactly what he was doing when that camera clicked. He was not collecting a souvenir, he was minting an insurance policy. By stepping out of the East End and into the very heart of the British establishment, Ronnie was planting his flag in Boothby's living room. He was proving that the walls protecting the elite were completely porous, provided you knew which base desires to exploit. Boothby, blinded by his addiction to the rough trade dynamic and his own staggering arrogance, allowed the photograph to be taken. He believed his status made him invulnerable, entirely failing to comprehend that he was willingly handing a loaded weapon to a paranoid schizophrenic. This arrogance was further compounded by a trail of spectacularly careless paperwork. Intoxicated by the thrill of his dangerous double life, Boothby began communicating with Ronnie Kray in writing. He sent handwritten letters, sometimes using official House of Lords stationery, casually inviting the most feared gangland boss in London over for a drink and a chat. It was an act of breathtaking hubris. Boothby treated Ronnie like a slightly rough around the edges gentleman caller, completely ignoring the reality that Ronnie was meticulously archiving every single piece of correspondence. Ronnie did not view these letters as friendly invitations. He viewed them as physical chains binding a peer of the realm to the criminal underworld. Every stamp, every signature, every casually penned sentence tightened the noose around Boothby's neck. As the months passed, the dynamic of their relationship began to shift with a cold, terrifying inevitability. The initial rush of the honey trap, the endless supply of young, dangerous men, the wild, chaotic orgies at Cedric Court, began to give way to the grim mechanics of extortion. Ronnie Kray was a man of infinite ambition and zero boundaries. He had built an empire on violence, but violence had its limits. The police were beginning to circle. Detectives from Scotland Yard, increasingly aware of the sheer scale of the Kray's extortion and protection rackets, were aggressively stepping up their surveillance of the firm. Ronnie needed something heavier than brass knuckles or razor blades to keep the law at bay. He needed a shield made of pure political power. Ronnie called in his debt. The transition from lover and procurer to political puppet master was swift and absolute. He did not need to make overt threats. The existence of the photographs, the letters, and the countless witnesses to Boothby's sexual indiscretions hung in the air like a guillotine. Ronnie made it abundantly clear that he expected Lord Boothby to use his considerable voice and influence within the corridors of Westminster to protect the Kray's business interests. He demanded that Boothby actively push back against the police investigation, to paint the Krays not as violent thugs, but as legitimate businessmen facing unfair harassment from overzealous detectives. For Boothby, the psychological impact of this demand must have been completely paralyzing. The intoxicating thrill of his rough trade fetish evaporated in an instant, replaced by the icy, suffocating dread of total ruin. He was a man who had stood beside Winston Churchill, a man who had helped steer the moral and political compass of the British Empire. Now, he was taking orders from a psychotic gangster who hallucinated enemies and settled disputes with extreme violence. The very danger he had so desperately sought out had mutated from a temporary sexual adrenaline rush into a permanent waking nightmare. He was a hostage, trapped in his own bespoke suits, imprisoned by his own desires. Yet despite the overwhelming terror, Boothby complied. He stood up in the House of Lords, the historic chamber where the laws of the land were forged, and he used his booming, authoritative voice to subvert the very justice system he had sworn to uphold. He asked pointed questions about police conduct. He quietly lobbied influential figures, dropping subtle hints that the aggressive tactics used against certain East End businessmen were un-British and heavy-handed. He never mentioned the Krays by name. That would have been a step too far even for his desperation, but his intent was unmistakable. He was throwing the considerable weight of his office directly into the path of the detectives, trying to dismantle a murderous syndicate. It was a staggering betrayal of the public trust. The lawmaker had become an active agent for the lawbreaker. As Boothby returned to his seat after defending the underworld, the heavy silence of the chamber must have felt like a physical weight. He knew exactly what he had done. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, sacrificing his integrity and his oath of office to buy the silence of a man who could destroy him with a single phone call. He was no longer a politician taking a risk. He was an employee of the firm, entirely compromised, entirely owned. But Ronnie Kray's appetite for control was insatiable, and his paranoia was rapidly deteriorating into absolute madness. Ronnie did not just want Boothby to work for him in the shadows. He wanted to flaunt him. He wanted the entire London underworld to know that the Colonel kept a lord on a leash. He dragged Boothby to Kray-owned nightclubs, parading the heavy-set aristocrat in front of hardened criminals and terrified associates. Boothby, often heavily intoxicated to numb the terror of his situation, sat in these smoke-filled rooms, smiling a frozen, desperate smile, desperately trying to maintain the illusion that he was a willing participant in this grotesque pantomime. This blatant, arrogant display of their toxic symbiosis was the exact catalyst that would bring their carefully constructed house of cards crashing down. The London of the early 1960s was an incredibly small, interconnected village at its highest and lowest echelons. You could not regularly parade a famous conservative politician through the most notorious gangland haunts in the city without people taking notice. Whispers began to spread. Bartenders, rival gangsters, and corrupt police officers all traded rumors of the bizarre, unholy alliance between the peer and the gangster. And inevitably, in a city driven by scandal and gossip, those whispers drifted out of the East End, floated across the Thames, and landed squarely on the desks of Fleet Street. The British press in 1964 was in a state of absolute ravenous bloodlust. Just a year prior, the entire nation had been rocked to its core by the Profumo affair, a spectacular scandal involving the Secretary of State for War, a young model named Christine Keeler, and a Soviet naval attaché. That scandal had shattered the illusion of establishment invulnerability, proving that the highest levels of government were just as susceptible to lust, blackmail, and gross incompetence as anyone else. The newspapers had tasted blood, and they were desperately hungry for more. They knew that the public appetite for seeing the aristocracy dragged through the mud was insatiable. When the rumors of Lord Boothby's deep, compromised involvement with the Kray twins reached the newsrooms, it was viewed not just as a story, but as the holy grail of investigative journalism. It had everything: extreme wealth, political power, the terrifying allure of organized crime, and the deeply taboo element of homosexuality. It was a story guaranteed to sell millions of papers and potentially topple the conservative government, which was still desperately clinging to power in the aftermath of the Profumo disaster. But the libel laws in the United Kingdom were notoriously draconian. A newspaper could not simply print allegations of this magnitude without absolutely bulletproof, incontrovertible evidence. If they misstepped, they faced catastrophic financial ruin. The editors at the Sunday Mirror faced a monumental dilemma. They had the story, they had the witnesses, and they knew about the photographs. But they also knew that naming a man of Boothby's stature as a homosexual associate of a murderous crime lord was the journalistic equivalent of jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. They needed to find a way to break the story, to force the issue into the public domain without triggering a lethal lawsuit. They needed to light the fuse without holding the dynamite. In the sweltering heat of July 1964, they made their move. The Sunday Mirror decided to execute a masterclass in aggressive, calculated innuendo. They crafted a front-page expose that was entirely devoid of specific names, but was so densely packed with identifying details that it was impossible to misinterpret. They prepared to drop a bombshell that would force both the British establishment and the London underworld into a desperate, terrifying struggle for survival. The private nightmare Boothby had been enduring in the shadows was about to be violently dragged into the blinding, unforgiving light of the national press. The game of psychological torture was over. The fight for total self-preservation was about to begin. On the morning of July 12, 1964, the trap that Lord Robert Boothby had so willingly walked into finally snapped shut for the entire world to see. As the sun rose over a sweltering London, hundreds of thousands of copies of the Sunday Mirror hit the newsstands, the breakfast tables of the working class, and the polished mahogany desks of the political elite. The front page did not feature a photograph of the peer and the gangster, nor did it explicitly state their names. Instead, it delivered a masterpiece of journalistic innuendo, a carefully constructed explosive device designed to bypass the strict British libel laws while maximizing the catastrophic damage to its targets. The headline screamed in massive, bold typography, "The Peer and the Gangster Yard Probe." Below it, a chilling subheadline taunted the public and the establishment alike. "The picture we must not print." The article that followed was a masterclass in calculated ambiguity. It detailed an ongoing Scotland Yard investigation into an alleged homosexual relationship between a prominent, highly respected figure in the House of Lords and a leading, notoriously violent figure in the London underworld. It described wild, lavish parties held in the East End, attended by this unnamed nobleman and a coterie of young, rough men with criminal records. It spoke of a deeply compromising photograph showing the peer and the gangster sitting on a sofa, a photograph that the newspaper claimed was actively being used as leverage by the criminal syndicate. It was a story of blackmail, sexual deviance, and high-level corruption. To the average reader in the countryside, it was a shocking, salacious mystery. But within the insulated, gossip-fueled corridors of Westminster, the gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall, and the smoke-filled pubs of the East End, there was absolutely no mystery at all. Everyone who mattered knew exactly who the article was about. Within hours of the newspaper's publication, the name Bob Boothby was on the lips of every politician, journalist, and police officer in the capital. The timing of the Sunday Mirror's revelation could not have been more devastating for the British establishment. The conservative government was already bleeding out, staggering from the catastrophic fallout of the Profumo affair just a year prior. The public had watched in horror and fascination as the Secretary of State for War was exposed for sharing a mistress with a Soviet spy, leading to high-profile trials, suicides, and the eventual resignation of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. The nation's trust in its ruling class was entirely shattered. The electorate had grown sick of the hypocrisy, the hidden decadence, and the absolute arrogance of the elite. The sudden emergence of a new scandal, one that combined the absolute taboo of homosexuality with the terrifying reality of organized crime, threatened to not just topple the government, but to completely dismantle the moral authority of the House of Lords. The political machine went into an immediate, blind panic. Telephones rang incessantly across the affluent neighborhoods of London as party whips, cabinet ministers, and intelligence officials desperately tried to assess the blast radius of the Sunday Mirror article. Trapped inside his luxurious apartment in Eaton Square, the very location where the fatal photograph had been taken, Lord Boothby faced the absolute collapse of his existence. The booming, confident voice that had echoed through the halls of Parliament was silenced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. He understood the lethal mechanics of the society he had helped govern. In 1964, a homosexual scandal did not merely end a political career, it ended a life. If the allegations were proven true, Boothby faced a catastrophic public trial, the stripping of his titles, the complete evaporation of his wealth, and a highly probable prison sentence involving hard labor. He would be reduced to a historical grotesque, an outcast despised by the public and abandoned by his peers. But the threat of the law was only half of his nightmare. The other half was currently residing in Cedar Court, Hackney. Boothby knew with absolute certainty that Ronnie Kray held the physical evidence required to destroy him. The photograph of them on the sofa, the handwritten letters inviting the gangster for drinks, these were the instruments of his execution, and they were in the hands of a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. As Boothby paced his apartment, the agonizing uncertainty of Ronnie's next move must have felt like a physical torture. Would Ronnie panic and release the photo to the press to spite the police? Would he demand an exorbitant sum of money? Or would he simply send his thugs to Eaton Square to silence the vulnerable lord before the police could interrogate him? Boothby was entirely powerless. He had sought out the visceral danger of the rough trade, and now that very danger had come to claim his life. He was a passenger in a vehicle speeding toward a cliff, and a madman was behind the wheel. But Ronnie Kray was not panicking. In the gritty epicenter of his East End empire, the gangster surveyed the exploding media storm with a cold, predatory calculation. Ronnie possessed a twisted, highly protective ego. He despised the press, and he violently despised the idea of his own homosexuality being publicly dissected by journalists, even if it was an open secret in the underworld. More importantly, Ronnie understood the fundamental rules of power. A ruined, disgraced lord sitting in a prison cell was absolutely useless to the firm. Ronnie did not want Boothby destroyed. He wanted Boothby indebted. He wanted the terrified politician to remain exactly where he was, sitting in the House of Lords, possessing the influence necessary to halt the Scotland Yard investigations that were threatening the Kray syndicate. Ronnie made a swift, ruthless decision. He would not throw Boothby to the wolves. Instead, he would force Boothby to fight, to lie to the entire nation, and in doing so bind the politician to the mafia forever. The underworld immediately closed ranks. Detectives attempting to follow up on the Sunday Mirror's claims found themselves hitting a wall of absolute silence. Witnesses who had attended the debauched parties at Cedar Court suddenly developed severe amnesia. The young men who had been supplied to Boothby vanished into the shadows. The Krays dispatched their enforcers to heavily intimidate any journalist who dared to sniff around their clubs or associates. The message from the East End was clear and terrifying. Anyone who corroborated the newspaper story would face severe physical consequences. Ronnie was doing his part to suppress the truth on the streets. Now it was up to Boothby to suppress the truth in the courts. Realizing that his only path to survival lay in absolute aggressive denial, Boothby turned to the ultimate architect of elite preservation, Lord Arnold Goodman. Goodman was not merely a lawyer. He was the supreme fixer of the British establishment. A man of immense physical bulk and terrifying intellect, Goodman served as the trusted confidant and legal bulldog for prime ministers, media moguls, and the aristocracy. He did not operate on the basis of morality or truth. He operated strictly on the basis of power and the weaponization of the law. When Boothby presented him with the Sunday Mirror article, Goodman immediately recognized the fatal flaw in the newspaper's strategy. By choosing to rely on innuendo and refusing to explicitly name Boothby, the editors had revealed a crucial weakness. They did not have the confidence to print the photograph. They were bluffing. Goodman understood the draconian nature of British libel law better than anyone alive. The burden of proof did not rest on the plaintiff to prove their innocence. It rested entirely on the defendant to prove the absolute truth of their allegations. If Boothby sued the Sunday Mirror for libel, the newspaper would be legally forced to produce undeniable evidence of the homosexual affair and the criminal association. Goodman calculated the odds with ice-cold precision. He knew the police would not hand over their confidential files to a tabloid. He knew the criminal witnesses in the East End were entirely terrified of Ronnie Kray and would never testify in an open court. And he deduced that if Ronnie Kray hadn't released the photograph yet, he likely never would, preferring to keep it as a private mechanism of blackmail rather than a public spectacle. Goodman devised a strategy of overwhelming legal shock and awe. He drafted letters of terrifying legal consequence, threatening the Sunday Mirror, its editors, and its parent company with the most severe libel action in the history of British jurisprudence. He informed them that Lord Boothby would not only deny the allegations, but would aggressively pursue damages that would bankrupt the publication. The strategy was clear. Do not defend, attack. Deny everything, admit nothing, and make the accusation itself seem like a treasonous assault on a great British patriot. But legal threats on paper were not enough to quell the national uproar. The public needed a spectacle. They needed to see the accused man look them in the eye and state his innocence. To execute this final crucial phase of the cover-up, Boothby had to perform an act of psychological compartmentalization so profound it bordered on the sociopathic. He had to go on national television and lie to millions of people, knowing with absolute certainty that the man holding the proof of his perjury was watching from the East End. The television broadcast that followed remains one of the most astonishing displays of political theater in British history. Boothby appeared on screen looking every inch the wounded, dignified elder statesman. The heavy jowls that normally conveyed a jovial, grandfatherly warmth were set into a rigid mask of righteous, aristocratic fury. He did not look like a man backed into a corner. He looked like a lion swatting away a fly. When the interviewer carefully broached the subject of the Sunday Mirror article, Boothby unleashed a masterclass in aggressive deception. He firmly, categorically, and passionately denied any inappropriate relationship with any member of the criminal underworld. He admitted with a carefully calculated air of casual dismissal to having briefly met a man named Kray on a purely business matter regarding a constituent, framing it as the tedious but necessary duty of a public servant. He vehemently denied attending any wild parties. He painted the newspaper's allegations as a foul, disgusting, and entirely fabricated smear campaign designed to sell cheap tabloids at the expense of a man who had dedicated his life to serving the crown. Watching the archival footage today is a profoundly unsettling experience. The sheer conviction in his voice, the steady, unblinking gaze into the camera lens. It is the performance of a man fighting for his absolute survival. But beneath the booming baritone and the tailored suit lay an abyss of personal degradation. At that very moment, as he invoked his honor and his decades of public service, Boothby knew he was entirely hollow. He knew he was publicly cementing his subservience to Ronnie Kray. He was saving his public reputation by permanently annihilating his private integrity. He was looking at the British public, but he was speaking directly to the gangster. Look what I am willing to do for you. Keep the photograph hidden. The bluff worked with a spectacular, devastating efficiency. The executives at the Sunday Mirror watched Boothby's broadcast and realized they were staring down the barrel of a legal and political firing squad. They looked at their evidence, a collection of rumors, circumstantial police reports, and witnesses who had suddenly gone completely silent due to underworld intimidation. They realized that without the physical photograph and without Ronnie Kray's cooperation, they could not definitively prove the allegations in a court of law against a man represented by Lord Goodman. The newspaper's resolve completely collapsed. They panicked, retreating from the front lines of investigative journalism and surrendering unconditionally to the power of the establishment. Within days of Boothby's television appearance, the Sunday Mirror published an apology of unprecedented, humiliating magnitude. They printed a front-page retraction, categorically withdrawing every single implication made in their original article. They stated clearly and unequivocally that Lord Boothby was a man of the highest moral standing, and that any suggestion tying him to the criminal underworld was entirely without foundation. To appease the fury of the elite, the newspaper's parent company fired the editor responsible for the story, sacrificing him to protect the corporate entity. And then came the financial capitulation. To avoid the spectacle of a prolonged trial, the Sunday Mirror agreed to an out-of-court settlement of £40,000. It was a staggering, record-breaking sum of money for 1964, equivalent to over £1 million in modern currency. On paper, it was the greatest triumph of Robert Boothby's life. He had stared down the most powerful media apparatus in the country, completely destroyed their credibility, walked away with a massive fortune, and emerged with his political standing officially untarnished. His colleagues in the House of Lords sent him letters of congratulation, praising his courage in standing up to the gutter press. The public, eager to believe in the integrity of their leaders after the exhaustion of the Profumo affair, largely accepted the newspaper's retraction as proof of a baseless witch hunt. Boothby had survived the unsurvivable, but this overwhelming victory was a hollow, putrid fiction enabled and orchestrated by the highest levels of the British state. Decades later, when the fiercely guarded MI5 intelligence files were finally declassified, the true, sickening extent of the cover-up was laid bare. The security services, the Home Office, and the senior ranks of the police force had known the truth the entire time. They possessed the surveillance reports detailing Boothby's deep, active participation in the homosexual underworld. They had files describing him and Ronnie Kray as hunters of young men who frequently attended illicit parties together. They knew about the honey trap. They knew about the extortion. Yet when the Sunday Mirror attempted to expose this profound national security risk, the establishment actively chose to blindfold justice. Terrified of another scandal that could shatter the fragile illusion of their moral superiority, the government subtly intervened. Pressure was quietly applied to Scotland Yard to ensure that no damning evidence was leaked to the defense lawyers. The intelligence agencies sat on their files, watching in silence as a major newspaper was financially gutted for telling the absolute truth. They protected Robert Boothby not because they respected him, but because he was one of their own, and his destruction would have cast a permanent, undeniable stain on the entire ruling class. The law, it was proven, was not a shield for the truth. It was a weapon used exclusively to protect the powerful from the consequences of their own depravity. And amid the congratulatory handshakes in Westminster and the desperate apologies in Fleet Street, the true victor of the entire ordeal sat quietly in the East End. Ronnie Kray watched the collapse of the Sunday Mirror with immense satisfaction. He had not only survived the police probe, but he had watched the British government actively dismantle the only institution brave enough to expose him. He still possessed the photograph, he still possessed the letters, but more importantly, he now possessed the soul of a lord. The aftermath of the Sunday Mirror settlement was not a moment of quiet reflection. It was a grotesque parade of establishment hypocrisy. Lord Robert Boothby had publicly slain the dragon of the gutter press. He was awarded £40,000, a staggering sum that today would comfortably exceed $1 million. In the grand dining halls of Westminster and the exclusive clubs of Pall Mall, he was toasted as a champion of aristocratic dignity, a man who had bravely drawn a line in the sand against the encroaching vulgarity of tabloid journalism. Yet, in the quiet, agonizing solitude of his own mind, Boothby knew exactly what that money represented. That staggering financial windfall was, in reality, blood money. It was the physical manifestation of his complete moral surrender. He was so repulsed by the settlement that he publicly declared he could not keep it, funneling the majority of the funds into various charities. He referred to it privately as tainted money, a phrase that carried a far darker truth than anyone in his polite social circles could possibly comprehend. But while Boothby was attempting to wash his hands of the financial windfall, the streets of the East End were whispering a very different story. According to deep-rooted underworld lore and subsequent historical investigations, a significant portion of that libel payout did not go to charity at all. It was quietly, systematically diverted into the pockets of Ronnie and Reggie Kray. This was the ultimate sickening punchline to the entire affair. Ronnie Kray had not only successfully blackmailed a prominent member of the House of Lords and forced the British government to suppress a major national newspaper, but he had actually been paid for the privilege. The legal system, designed to protect the innocent from the wicked, had been completely inverted to funnel a massive fortune directly into the hands of a psychopathic crime syndicate. Ronnie boasted about it openly to his inner circle. He took immense, terrifying pride in knowing that the elite classes, who looked at him with such profound disdain, were actively financing his criminal empire out of sheer, pathetic terror. From that moment in the summer of 1964 onward, the trajectory of Bob Boothby's life fundamentally fractured. On the outside, he maintained the facade. He continued to attend the House of Lords. He continued to make television appearances, offering his booming authoritative opinions on the moral and political direction of the country. But the man inside the bespoke suits was effectively dead. The political ambition that had driven him for decades completely evaporated. He was no longer a statesman shaping the future. He was a hostage frantically managing the present. Try to imagine the psychological toll of that existence. Every single day, Boothby woke up knowing that his freedom, his wealth, and his entire historical legacy rested on the volatile, heavily medicated whims of a paranoid schizophrenic. Every time the telephone rang in his Belgravia apartment, his heart must have seized with the sheer, icy dread that it was Ronnie on the other end of the line. The thrill of the rough trade, the desperate, adrenaline-fueled pursuit of danger that had initially drawn him to the East End was entirely gone. The danger was no longer a temporary sexual fantasy. It was the permanent, suffocating reality of his life. He had wanted to touch the fire of the underworld, but he had entirely failed to realize that the fire does not let go. Ronnie Kray did not let him go. The demands for political cover continued. The veiled threats, the mandatory appearances at Kray-affiliated events, the constant grinding pressure to remain useful to the firm became the defining characteristics of Boothby's existence. He was a wealthy, powerful man who lived in a state of absolute abject submission. He could not go to the police because the police were the very people he had lied to on national television. He could not go to his political allies because his political allies were the ones who had orchestrated the cover-up to protect themselves. He was entirely, profoundly alone, trapped in a prison constructed from his own desires and sealed shut by his own lies. As the 1960s burned on, the situation grew infinitely more dangerous. The Kray twins, emboldened by their seeming invincibility and their successful manipulation of the establishment, began to lose whatever tenuous grip they still had on reality. Ronnie's paranoia deepened into absolute madness. He began to see enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whispered conversation. The violence of the firm, which had always been brutal, suddenly became erratic, public, and entirely uncontrollable. In March 1966, the terrifying reality of Boothby's captor was laid bare for the entire country. Ronnie Kray walked into the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel, a rival gang's territory, calmly approached a gangster named George Cornell and shot him point blank in the forehead in front of a room full of witnesses. It was an act of staggering theatrical savagery. For Boothby, reading the newspaper reports of the murder must have been a moment of paralyzing horror. This was not a rumor. This was not an exaggerated story of rough men doing rough things. The man holding the photographs, the man holding the keys to his entire life, was a cold-blooded, unhinged murderer who killed in broad daylight. The pressure continued to mount when, the following year, Reggie Kray matched his brother's savagery by brutally stabbing an associate named Jack the Hat McVitie to death at a frantic, blood-soaked house party. The Krays were completely out of control. They had crossed a line that even the corrupt, self-serving establishment could no longer ignore. The wall of silence in the East End, maintained by fear for over a decade, finally began to crack. A dedicated, relentless Scotland Yard detective named Leonard Nipperred was slowly, methodically building a case that not even a lord could derail. In May 1968, the police finally struck. In a massive, coordinated dawn raid, the Kray twins and the senior members of the firm were dragged from their beds and arrested. The reign of terror was over. The subsequent trial in 1969 was a media sensation, a gruesome parade of violence, intimidation, and underworld depravity. Ronnie and Reggie were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the judge recommending they serve no less than 30 years. For Lord Boothby, watching the downfall of the Krays from the safe, insulated distance of Westminster, the emotions must have been a chaotic, agonizing mixture of profound relief and absolute terror. The men who had tormented him for years were finally behind bars. The immediate physical threat to his life was removed, but the psychological threat remained entirely active. Ronnie Kray was going to prison for the rest of his life. He had nothing left to lose. He was a man deeply obsessed with his own legacy and his own power. What was stopping him from standing up in the courtroom, pulling the photograph from his pocket, and dragging the great Lord Boothby down into the abyss with him? What was stopping him from telling the press exactly how he had manipulated the highest levels of the British government? But Ronnie remained silent. He went to his cell and eventually to the high-security psychiatric wards of Broadmoor Hospital without ever publicly detonating the bomb he held over Boothby's head. Why? Why did a man so prone to explosive violence and theatrical displays of power choose to keep the secret? The answer lies in the deeply twisted psychology of Ronnie Kray. To release the photograph, to publicly expose Boothby, would have been an admission that the game was over. It would have meant giving up his ultimate prize. In Ronnie's fractured mind, keeping the secret was the ultimate proof of his superiority. As long as the public believed Boothby was a respectable lord, and as long as Ronnie knew the truth, Ronnie remained the master. He was the gangster who owned a piece of the establishment that no one else could touch. The secret was his trophy, and he took it with him to his grave. Boothby survived. He lived another 18 years after the Krays were locked away. He even married a woman late in life, a quiet companion who helped him navigate his declining years. He continued to be a respected broadcaster, a man sought out for his opinions on the great historical events of the 20th century. When he died in 1986 at the age of 86, the obituaries praised his long service to the nation, his friendship with Churchill, and his enduring charismatic presence in British public life. He went to his grave with his reputation entirely intact. The establishment cover-up had held firm. The great lie had survived the man who told it. It took another 3 decades for the truth to breach the concrete walls of official secrecy. In 2015, declassified MI5 intelligence files laid bare the raw mechanics of the cover-up. The government had known everything: the honey trap, the extortion, the deep entanglement with a murderous syndicate. They chose to blindfold justice. Boothby traded his soul for a moment of danger and spent the rest of his life pretending he had never felt the heat of the fire. He was not an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeply compromised system, a system where the lines between the lawmaker and the criminal were entirely erased by mutual blackmail.